The battle had been going on for 11 years. 11 years of the Vethkari expanse burning. 11 years of two civilizations, the Surati Collective and the Mhenvar Empire, throwing everything they had at each other across a stretch of space that had once been a trade corridor and was now a graveyard of broken ships and dead stars, and 11 years of accumulated grief on both sides. The casualty counts were enormous. The diplomatic situation was, in the assessment of every neutral party that had attempted mediation in 11 years, completely hopeless. Not because peace was impossible in principle. Because neither side was willing to be the first to stop. Because 11 years of war had produced enough dead that stopping felt, to both sides, like betraying them. Because the war had taken on a life of its own independent of its original causes, which both sides had largely forgotten, sustained now by the momentum of loss and the particular terrible logic of a conflict that had gone on long enough that continuing seemed less painful than the alternative. 11 years. 43 failed mediation attempts. Hundreds of thousands of casualties. And then, on a Tuesday, because the universe has no respect for dramatic timing, a human research vessel called the Persistent Curiosity came out of a miscalculated jump point directly into the middle of the largest engagement of the entire war. Right between both fleets. In the exact center of 11 years of accumulated hatred. The Persistent Curiosity had a crew of 9. No weapons. No shields beyond standard civilian grade. No business whatsoever being in the Vethkari expanse. What happened in the next 72 hours would end an 11-year war. Not because the humans were powerful. Because they were human. And sometimes, in the specific calculus of a universe that had seen a great deal but had not seen everything, that is exactly enough. The Persistent Curiosity. The Persistent Curiosity was not a warship. This was obvious from approximately every angle. It was a civilian research vessel, mid-sized, built for long-range survey work, with sensor arrays that took up space that a military designer would have used for weapons systems and laboratory modules where a military designer would have put troop quarters. It had the particular aesthetic of a ship designed by scientists who cared about function and had opinions about where to put the coffee machine and had never once considered what the ship would look like to a hostile sensor array. It looked, to a hostile sensor array, like a target. Its crew of 9 reflected its purpose. Captain Amara Osebansu, 38 years old, from Accra, Ghana, 15 years of deep space research navigation, the kind of captain who had gotten this job because she was genuinely the best person available for it and who ran her ship with the particular combination of absolute competence and complete informality that characterized the best research vessel commanders. Dr. James Kowalski, xenoastrophysicist, whose work on stellar formation and contested corridor systems had been the reason for this particular survey mission and who had been, at the moment of the jump miscalculation, in the middle of eating a sandwich and reviewing data and had experienced the emergency primarily as an interruption to both. Dr. Yemi Adeyemi, xenolinguistics specialist, brought along because the survey was passing through a region with documented pre-collapse civilization remnants and someone needed to read the signs. She had spent the 72 hours before the jump teaching the ship's junior researcher to play chess. 6 others, engineers, a medical officer, a navigation specialist whose jump calculation error had brought them here and who was, in the immediate aftermath, experiencing the specific professional horror of someone whose mistake had just become everyone's problem. None of them were soldiers. None of them had weapons training beyond the basic certification required for deep space work. None of them had any protocol for the situation they found themselves in. What they had was the thing that human crews on research vessels always had, because deep space research work selects for it, the same way Deathworld evolution selected for it, the same way every genuinely difficult environment selects for the organisms that can function inside it. They had the ability to think clearly when everything was going wrong. What they flew into. The Battle of Veth 7 was, by the standards of the 11-year war, enormous. 412 Surati vessels on one side. 389 Mhenvar vessels on the other. Energy weapons filling the space between them. Explosions. Hull breaches. The particular terrible efficiency of two civilizations that had spent 11 years getting very good at hurting each other. The Persistent Curiosity came out of its jump point at 0847 station time. Directly between both fleets. The jump had gone wrong in the specific way that jumps went wrong when the navigation calculation was based on survey data that was 11 years out of date, which was how old the Vethkari expanse charts were, because nobody had been surveying the Vethkari expanse for 11 years because the Vethkari expanse had been an active war zone for 11 years. The persistent curiosity arrived in the middle of a battle with the particular bad luck of a ship that had done nothing wrong except trust old data. Captain Osebansu had approximately 4 seconds between arrival and the moment she understood what she was looking at. She used them well. "All stop," she said. "Full power to civilian distress beacon. Navigation, do not jump, repeat do not jump, we don't know what's on the other side of anything here. Weapons, we don't have any." Dr. Kowalski put down the sandwich. "I'm nearly finished." "James." He put down the sandwich. "What is our status?" she said. "We are," her sensor officer said, in the voice of someone reading information they would very much prefer to be reading differently, directly between two active combat fleets. "We are being targeted by approximately 40 vessels on each side. Our civilian distress beacon is active. Our shields are at standard civilian grade, which is insufficient," she said. "I know. Why aren't they firing?" A pause. "I don't know, Captain." She looked at the sensor display. At 412 ships on one side and 389 on the other, all of whom had targeting locks on the persistent curiosity and none of whom were firing. "Dr. Adeyemi," she said. "Captain. You're our xenolinguistics specialist." "Yes." "Start talking to them. Why they didn't fire." The reason neither fleet fired on the persistent curiosity in those first minutes was not, as would later be romanticized in several accounts of the incident, because of any inherent nobility on either side. It was because both fleets had the same problem at the same moment. The persistent curiosity was directly between them. In the specific geometry of the battle, which had, in the seconds before the jump arrival, been developing toward a decisive exchange that both fleet commanders had been building toward for 3 weeks, the civilian vessel had appeared in the exact position that made firing on it, from either side, geometrically equivalent to firing toward the other fleet's position. Both fleet commanders had the same calculation on their screens. Fire on the civilian vessel, risk your own ships from the exchange. Don't fire, and the vessel sits between you, emitting a civilian distress beacon that every neutral monitoring system in the sector was already picking up. Both sides paused. It was the first pause in 11 years of continuous fighting. It lasted, this first pause, before anyone said anything, before any communication was exchanged, 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, Dr. Yemi Adeyemi had established communication protocols with both fleets, begun running the translation matrices for both species' languages, and was composing her opening communication with the focused speed of someone who understood that she had a window that was going to close and needed to use it. She sent the same message to both fleets simultaneously. It said, "This is the civilian research vessel Persistent Curiosity. We are a non-military scientific survey ship. We have no weapons. We have 9 crew members. We arrived here by navigational error and we are aware that we are in an active conflict zone. We are requesting safe passage. While we are requesting safe passage, we would like to note that we appear to be the only vessel in this engagement that is not currently shooting at anything, and we wonder if that might be worth discussing." Admiral Soraveth. Admiral Soraveth had commanded the Surati fleet for 6 of the 11 years of the war. She was, in the Surati Collective's military hierarchy, the architect of their most significant tactical successes, 3 engagements that had pushed the Mhenvar back from systems that the Collective had considered lost, achieved through a combination of strategic patience and the willingness to accept short-term losses for long-term positional advantage. She was also, though this was not in her official file, exhausted. Not physically, she managed her rest cycles with the discipline of a professional. Cognitively exhausted. The specific exhaustion that came from 6 years of making decisions that cost lives and carrying the weight of those decisions while preparing to make the next ones. She had been 3 weeks from what her tactical analysis said was a decisive engagement. An engagement that would, if the projections held, end the war on Surati terms. And then a civilian ship had appeared between the fleets. She looked at the communication from the persistent curiosity. She read it twice. We appear to be the only vessel in this engagement that is not currently shooting at anything, and we wonder if that might be worth discussing. She sat with that sentence for a moment. Then she opened a channel to her tactical officer. What species is the crew of that vessel? Human, Admiral. All 9 crew members. She had heard of humans. The new species, recently spacefaring, from a death world, with a reputation that was still being formed in the galactic consciousness. She had read the preliminary assessments. Had filed them under not immediately relevant to current operational priorities. What do we know about them? She said. Limited information, Admiral. They are classified as a death world species. Persistence hunters. High adaptability. No significant military presence in this region. They have no weapons. Correct. They flew into the middle of a battle with no weapons. By navigational error, according to their transmission. She looked at the persistent curiosity on her sensor display. Small. Civilian. Sitting between 2 of the largest fleets assembled in the war with its distress beacon active and its shields at civilian grade and 9 crew members who had, apparently, decided that the appropriate response to this situation was to send a message asking if not shooting at things might be worth discussing. Open a channel, she said. Commander Vethron. On the other side of the engagement, Commander Vethron of the Mhenvar Empire was having a similar experience. He had read the same communication. He had the same tactical problem. He had also, and this was something he would not include in his official after-action report, laughed. Not loudly. Not for long. A short, involuntary sound that his tactical officer had the professionalism to pretend he hadn't heard. But he had laughed. Because in 11 years of war, in hundreds of engagements, in the accumulated weight of everything the Mhenvar Empire and the Surati Collective had done to each other, nobody had ever sent a message like that. We appear to be the only vessel in this engagement that is not currently shooting at anything. Factually accurate. Delivered without apparent irony. By a crew of 9 with no weapons who had arrived here by accident and whose response to finding themselves between 2 war fleets was apparently to point out that not shooting was an option and inquire whether anyone wanted to talk about it. He opened a channel to his communications officer. Get me the human vessel, he said. The conversation. Dr. Adeyemi was simultaneously managing communication channels with both fleets, running real-time translation matrices for 2 species whose languages she had been studying for approximately 40 minutes, and drinking a cup of coffee that Captain Osebansu had quietly placed at her station because she had noticed that Adeyemi did her best work with coffee. She was, in the assessment of her colleagues, completely in her element. The first substantive communication from the Surati fleet came from Admiral Soraveth directly. It said, human vessel. You are in a restricted combat zone. You will be granted a temporary ceasefire window for evacuation purposes. State your intended departure vector. Adeyemi looked at Captain Osebansu. Osebansu looked at the sensor display. If we jump from our current position, the navigation officer said quietly, we have 3 viable vectors. All of them take us through active engagement zones. The probability of. Not good, Osebansu said. No. She looked at the sensor display. At 412 ships on one side. 389 on the other. At the geometry of the situation, the persistent curiosity sitting in the exact center of something that had been building for 11 years and was, right now, paused. Dr. Adeyemi, she said. Tell them we appreciate the ceasefire window. Tell them we have a navigational problem with the departure vectors and we're working on it. And tell them, she paused. Tell them we'd like to talk. Adeyemi looked at her. About what? About anything, Osebansu said. Keep them talking. As long as they're talking to us, they're not shooting at each other. Adeyemi looked at the communication channels. At 2 fleets that had been at war for 11 years, both of whom currently had open channels to a civilian research vessel with 9 crew members and no weapons. Captain, she said. I think you might be onto something. She started talking. Hour 1 through 6, the talking. Dr. Adeyemi talked. This was, in the most literal sense, her job. She was a xenolinguistics specialist. Her entire professional life had been built around the specific skill of crossing the gap between different forms of communication and finding the meaning on the other side. She had never done it quite like this. Simultaneously. Both fleets. In real time. In 2 languages she had been studying for less than an hour. She talked to Admiral Soraveth about the Sarati Collective's history, asking questions, not making statements. The specific questions that xenolinguists learn to ask, the ones that opened rather than closed, that invited rather than demanded, that made the person being asked feel that their answer mattered. She talked to Commander Vethran about the Mhenvar Empire's traditions, the same approach, the same quality of attention. She was not gathering intelligence. She was not negotiating. She was not doing anything that resembled formal diplomacy. She was listening. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that Captain Osebansu, monitoring the communication channels from her station, would describe in her after-action report as the moment she understood what was happening, was that both the Admiral and the Commander were talking. Not strategically. Not carefully. Not in the measured, calculated way that 11 years of war had trained them to communicate with everything. Just talking. Because someone was listening. Because a xenolinguistics specialist from a small blue planet had been trained, specifically and thoroughly, in the skill of making people feel heard. And in 11 years of war, apparently, neither Admiral Soraveth nor Commander Vethran had felt heard. Hour 6 through 24, the complications. At hour 6, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the Neutral Monitoring Network's alert system, triggered by the civilian distress beacon that the persistent Curiosity had been broadcasting since arrival, began routing emergency notifications to every neutral party with diplomatic presence in the sector. This meant that within 6 hours, 14 different neutral civilizations were aware that a human civilian vessel was sitting between 2 war fleets in the Vethkari Expanse, that both fleets had maintained a ceasefire for 6 hours, and that communication was ongoing. The 14 neutral parties began, immediately, debating whether and how to intervene. Second, Captain Osebansu's engineering team completed their assessment of the persistent Curiosity's jump drive. The news was not good. The jump miscalculation had stressed the drive's primary motivator coil beyond its rated tolerance. It was functional but required recalibration before safe jump, a process that the chief engineer estimated would take between 40 and 60 hours. They were not going anywhere quickly. Third, Dr. James Kowalski, who had been spending the first 6 hours of the ceasefire doing what he always did when he was not needed for the immediate crisis, which was work, had noticed something in the sensor data. Something about the Vethkari Expanse that had not been in the 11-year-old survey charts. Something that changed, in ways he was still calculating, the strategic picture of the entire conflict. He brought it to Captain Osebansu. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Are you certain?" she said. "I'm a scientist," he said. "I'm never certain. But I'm close." "How close?" "Close enough that I think the Admiral and the Commander should see this." Osebansu looked at the data. At the sensor readings. At what they meant. At the implication, if Kowalski was right, for 11 years of a war that had been fought over something that no longer existed in the form either side believed it did. "Dr. Adeyemi," she said. "Captain. I need you to set up a 3-way communication. Us, the Sarati fleet, the Mhenvar fleet. Simultaneously." A pause. "That's not standard protocol, Captain. The 2 sides haven't communicated directly in." "I know," Osebansu said. "Set it up anyway." The data. The Vethkari Expanse had been, 11 years ago, the site of the largest deposit of Vareth-7 crystals in the known galaxy. Vareth-7 crystals were, in the energy production technology of both the Sarati Collective and the Mhenvar Empire, essentially irreplaceable. The crystals were a core component of both civilizations' primary energy infrastructure. Without them, significant portions of both economies would face severe disruption. The war had started over the Vethkari Expanse. Over who controlled the crystals. Dr. Kowalski's sensor data showed that the crystals were gone. Not depleted, gone. Destabilized, by 11 years of energy weapon discharge in the region, into a compound that was chemically inert and energetically useless. The sensor readings were unambiguous. The Verith 7 deposits that both sides had been fighting over for 11 years had been destroyed slowly, progressively, by the fighting itself. Both sides had been destroying the thing they were fighting to control. For 11 years. The deposit was gone. There was nothing left to fight over. Kowalski presented this data to Admiral Soroveth and Commander Vethron simultaneously, in the three-way communication that Dr. Adeyemi had set up, and that represented the first direct communication between the two sides in 11 years. He presented it the way scientists presented data, clearly, methodically, without drama. Here is what the sensors show. Here is what it means. Here are the error margins. Here is why I'm confident in the conclusion. He then sat back and waited. The silence that followed was the longest silence Dr. Adeyemi had ever sat inside. Longer than the 47 seconds when the persistent curiosity had first arrived. Longer than anything. Admiral Soroveth spoke first. She said, in a voice that Adeyemi's translation matrix rendered with careful precision, "How long has it been gone?" Kowalski checked his analysis. Based on the degradation pattern, approximately 4 years. Another silence. "We have been fighting," Commander Vethron said, slowly, "for 4 years, over nothing." "You've been fighting for 11 years, Kowalski said, with the directness of a scientist who had not fully processed the diplomatic implications of what he was saying. "The last 4 years it's been over nothing. Before that it was over something that you were destroying by fighting over it." Captain Osebansu looked at Kowalski. He looked back. "Was that," he said quietly. "Too direct," she said. "A little. Probably." She looked at the communication channels. "Let's see what happens." What Admiral Soroveth did. Admiral Soroveth sat in her command chair for a long time after the three-way communication ended. Her tactical officer didn't speak. Her staff didn't speak. They had learned, in 6 years of serving under her, that when she was thinking this particular kind of thinking, the correct response was silence. She was thinking about 4 years. 4 years of her fleet fighting over a deposit that was already gone when she took command. 4 years of the decisions she had made, the tactical calls, the accepted losses, the strategic moves, all predicated on the assumption that the Verith 7 deposit still existed and still mattered. 4 years of dead. For nothing. She thought about the human scientist. The way he had presented the data, no agenda, no diplomatic framing, just the information and its implications laid out with the clean directness of someone who thought the truth was more important than comfort. She thought about the human linguist who had spent 6 hours listening to her in a way that she couldn't quite articulate except to say that it had felt like being seen. Not assessed. Not managed. Seen. She thought about the human captain who had flown into the middle of a battle with no weapons and responded to the situation by keeping everyone talking. She opened a channel to her fleet command. "Stand down to defensive posture," she said. Her tactical officer turned. "Admiral." "Defensive posture," she said again. "We are not withdrawing. We are standing down offensive capability while I pursue a communication. Record my order. Timestamp it." She paused. "And get me a channel to the Mhenvar commander," she said. "Direct. Not through the human vessel." The tactical officer stared at her. "Direct," she said. "For the first time in 11 years, let's try talking to each other." What Commander Vethron did. Commander Vethron had already issued the same order. Stand down to defensive posture. His tactical staff had reacted the same way, barely controlled surprise, professionally managed. He had given the same instruction, record it, timestamp it. And then he had sat with the data that the human scientist had presented. Not the strategic implications, he would work through those. Not the political consequences, those would take months to untangle. He sat with a simpler thing. 4 years. He had a list. Every commander kept a list, though most wouldn't call it that. The names. The ships. The engagements. The decisions he had made and the people those decisions had cost. He went through the last 4 years of the list. Then he put it away. And he opened the channel that his communications officer had established to the Surati fleet. Admiral Soravetha's face appeared on his screen. They looked at each other. 11 years of war. Hundreds of engagements. Everything they had done to each other's civilizations. Looking at each other directly for the first time. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Admiral Soraveth said, "The human scientist." Was he right? His sensor methodology is sound, Vethron said. I had my own team verify it in the last hour. And he was right. Another silence. Then, Admiral Soraveth said, "We have a problem." "We have many problems," Vethron said. "But yes. The immediate one is that we have been fighting a war for 11 years and the thing we were fighting over no longer exists. What do we do about that?" He thought about it. "I think," he said slowly, "we stop." Hour 72. The ceasefire agreement, preliminary, fragile, full of the specific uncertainties that 11 years of war produced when two sides tried to stop, was signed at hour 72. Not a peace treaty. Those took time. Negotiation. The careful work of dismantling 11 years of accumulated grievance and building something in its place. But a ceasefire. A formal, documented, mutually acknowledged ceasefire. The first in 11 years. It was signed in the particular informality of a historic moment that nobody had properly prepared for in the Persistent Curiosity's small conference room, which was the only neutral space available and which normally hosted Dr. Kowalski's data review meetings and had, at the time of the signing, a half-eaten sandwich on the side table that nobody had found the moment to remove. Admiral Soraveth noted the sandwich. Said nothing about it. Signed the document. Commander Vethron noted the sandwich. Said nothing about it. Signed the document. Captain Osebansu witnessed it. Dr. Adeyemi translated the final language of the agreement, working for the last time as the communication bridge between the two sides, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent 72 hours doing the thing she was best at and had done it as well as it could be done. And Dr. Kowalski, who had been the one to find the data, who had presented it with the clean directness of a scientist who thought the truth mattered more than comfort, who had spent 72 hours running additional analysis and cross-checking his results and was now absolutely certain, stood at the back of the room and watched two admirals sign a ceasefire because his sensor data had told them they had nothing left to fight over. He picked up the sandwich. Finished it. "James," Captain Osebansu said. "We've been here 72 hours, he said. "I'm hungry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. And in the Persistent Curiosity's conference room, with a ceasefire document on the table and 11 years of war paused outside the viewport, the 9 crew members of a civilian research vessel that had no weapons and no business being here laughed together. Admiral Soraveth and Commander Vethron looked at them. Looked at each other. Something passed between them that neither would put in their official reports. Something that, in the specific vocabulary of beings who had spent 11 years trying to end each other, had no established name. Recognition, maybe. Of the absurdity of it. Of the particular absurdity of 11 years of war paused by 9 scientists with no weapons who had arrived by accident and responded by talking. Commander Vethron made a sound. It was not a laugh, his species equivalent was different. But it was in the same family. And Admiral Soravetha's sensory crest elevated in the Surati equivalent. And in the Persistent Curiosity's conference room, improbably, in the middle of 11 years of war, everyone in the room was making the sound of something releasing. What the galaxy said. The 14 neutral parties who had been monitoring the situation since hour 6 had, by hour 72, been joined by 47 more. The ceasefire had been observed in real time by more neutral witnesses than any diplomatic event in the sector's recent history. The analysis papers that followed, written by diplomats, military strategists, xenopsychologists, historians, tried to explain what had happened. Most of them focused on the data. On Kowalski's discovery. On the strategic logic of a ceasefire once both sides understood that the resource they had been fighting over was gone. The strategic logic was real. It mattered. But the xenopsychological analysis written by a Threnke scholar named Cathar, who had been studying human military and diplomatic behavior for 2 years, made a different argument. The data was necessary, Cathar wrote. But it was not sufficient. Both sides had access to sensor technology capable of detecting the crystal degradation. Neither side had run the analysis. Not because they lacked capability. Because in 11 years of war, neither side had sent a vessel into the engagement zone with no weapons and no agenda except to understand what was there. The humans did not end the war. They created the conditions under which the war could end. By talking. By listening. By presenting data without agenda. By being, in the specific geometry of a situation that had calcified over 11 years, something that neither side knew how to classify. Not a threat. Not an ally. Not a negotiator with a position to advance. Just 9 people with a broken jump drive and no weapons who thought that not shooting at things was worth discussing. The galaxy has professional mediators. Trained negotiators. Diplomatic corps with centuries of experience. None of them ended the Battle of Veth 7. 9 scientists with a sandwich did. I have been studying humans for 2 years. I am no longer surprised. I am, however, still delighted. I think I always will be. 6 months later. The persistent curiosity had long since returned to its survey mission. The jump drive had been repaired. In the end, it had taken 51 hours, slightly longer than the chief engineer's estimate, which she had taken as a personal affront and had resolved never to repeat. The mission had continued. The survey data from the Vethkari expanse, all of it, not just the crystal degradation findings, had been published. It was, in the assessment of the xenoastrophysical community, significant work. Dr. Kowalski had received 3 invitations to present at major conferences. He had accepted all 3, on the condition that the conference organizers understood he would also be finishing whatever meal he was eating at the time of any significant discovery. Dr. Adeyemi had been approached by the newly formed Vethkari Peace Commission, the body that was doing the slow, difficult work of turning a ceasefire into an actual peace, to serve as linguistic consultant. She had said yes. She was very busy. Captain Osebansu had filed her after-action report. It was thorough, as her reports always were. It covered the navigational error, the technical situation, the communication strategy, the data discovery, the ceasefire process. The final section was headed Lessons Learned. It contained 1 paragraph. In 72 hours, with no weapons, no diplomatic mandate, and no plan beyond keeping everyone talking, 9 crew members of a civilian research vessel created the conditions for the first ceasefire in an 11-year war. The lesson is not that civilians should fly into active war zones. The lesson is what happened when they did. They talked. They listened. They shared what they found without agenda. They kept the conversation going when it could have ended. They were, in a situation that rewarded aggression and calculation, simply human. I don't know how to teach that. I'm not sure it needs to be taught. I think it might just be what we are. End report. Captain Amara Osebansu. CNV Persistent Curiosity. In the Vethkari expanse, the guns were silent. The broken ships were still there, 11 years of them, the accumulated wreckage of a war that had eaten itself. But the guns were silent. And in the silence, the first survey vessels in 11 years, neutral parties, cleared by both sides, were moving through the expanse. Mapping. Documenting. Understanding, for the first time in more than a decade, what was actually there. One of them was human. Of course it was. They had no weapons. They had no plan. They had no business being there. They had a broken jump drive, 9 crew members, a xenolinguistics specialist who could talk to anyone, a scientist who thought the truth was more important than comfort, and a captain who understood that as long as people were talking they weren't shooting. They flew into the middle of an 11-year war. And they kept everyone talking. Until a scientist finished his sensor analysis and told two admirals, with the clean directness of someone who thought the truth mattered more than anything, that they had been fighting over nothing for 4 years. And the admirals, who had spent 11 years trying to end each other, looked at each other for the first time. And stopped. Not because the humans were powerful. Not because they were armed. Because they were human. Because they talked. And listened. And found the truth. And shared it. And sometimes, in the specific geometry of a universe that has seen a great deal, that is exactly enough. Subscribe to Humans Hit Different for more HFY stories. New drops regularly. The galaxy keeps underestimating us. We keep showing up anyway. Bell subscribe. We're still talking. We always will be.